Hi, my name is Rita and you're watching my channel Pretty Much Paper. For the last couple weeks I've been experimenting with Armour Etch, which is a glass etching cream that a lot of crafters have been using lately, and you can use this with your Cricut Joy to create designs that you want out of vinyl. It's actually been a bit of a tricky process, I'm not going to lie. I've gone through a lot of different test runs, which means that now I have a really good solution that I think will help out a lot of people that are learning how to etch glass as well. As you can see here, I did my tests on pasta sauce jars actually, and in total I have 25 test runs down, so I'm pretty confident in the solution that I've come to, and I'm really excited to share it with you guys. Alright, so first I'm going to explain how you can make your stencil using permanent vinyl. Here I have Oracle's permanent vinyl, and I've got my test design repeated 4 times, and I'm going to weed out the areas that I would like to have the frosted glass appearance show up. This is kind of the reverse of how you would typically weed for other vinyl projects. Once the areas have been removed, I can apply my transfer tape over the vinyl and transfer onto the glass. To do this, I need to prepare the glass first, so I'm going to be cleaning off the surface where I want to adhere the vinyl using some isopropyl alcohol. Applying this is going to make sure that there aren't any fingerprints or any other residue left on the surface. Once the alcohol is completely dried, you can begin to apply your vinyl decal. So it's really important to make sure that this stencil is laying as flat and as smooth against the glass surface as possible. So I'm actually going to burnish the vinyl as well using a scraper, making sure that there are no air bubbles immediately next to any of the openings where I want to place the Armour Etch. If bubbles occur, then we could end up with some leaks in the etching, and it just won't look quite as nice. Once the stencil is in place, I can apply some painter's tape around the edges. This too is going to help protect the glass around the stencil, so that way we won't end up with any ghosting or any etching in the areas where we wouldn't want to see it. In my case, since I'm doing test runs in multiples, I'm actually going to cover up each individual test run with its own layer of tape, so I can easily remove it later down the line and proceed on to the next test run. So now that the glass is ready, I can use my Armour Etch. This is a really small bottle, but it's really all that I need. I'm going to make sure that I've got it thoroughly mixed. For those who have a brand new bottle of Armour Etch, it is also recommended that you stir your bottle up using something like a popsicle stick. Do keep in mind that Armour Etch is a caustic acid, and so it's really important to protect your skin. Of course, if you do end up with any of this on your skin, just be absolutely sure that you wash your hands with soap and water as soon as you can. So now I'm going to get into the breakdown of all 25 of my different test runs. I want to mention here that for the sake of time, I'm placing up to 4 different test runs in each frame, and each of those individual frames may be run at a different speed. So I've also been sure to include my stopwatch in the frame for each of these, so you have a sense of how much time has passed. Okay, so here are the first 4 tests. You can see that in test 1, I'm applying Armour Etch in a thick coat by using a popsicle stick. I'm going to let that sit for 5 minutes after complete application. For test 2, I'm doing the same thing but using a very thin coat of Armour Etch. This is being applied with a paintbrush. Most of the test runs are applied with a paintbrush, which is about ½ inch wide. For test 3, I'm doing a thin coat, but I'm going to move the Armour Etch on the surface of the glass at least 2 times. Since it will be a 5-minute duration, I'll be moving at 1.5 and 3.5 minutes. For test 4, I'm applying a thin coat, and I'll be moving the cream consistently for the entire 5-minute duration. I hope that seeing all of these different test runs is going to make it very clear the difference in the amount of Armour Etch that's being used and the exact application method as well. You can see pretty clearly that the difference between test 1 and test 2, just by looking at it, test 1 obviously has a lot more Armour Etch. That was one of the big issues that I ran into when I was first starting out with these experiments. I watched plenty of videos, but it was always a little bit difficult to gauge how much Armour Etch was actually being used. So between these 25 different test runs, I hope that this will paint a pretty clear picture of the amount that I think at least works the best. Once your etching is complete, you can rinse off the Armour Etch under a sink. You want to make sure that it's going directly under the running water and the flow is going over an area that you have taped off and protected. Otherwise, you can get some ghosting. To remove any remaining Armour Etch, you can do this with a gloved finger or with a paintbrush. I am always making sure that I'm wearing gloves during this rinsing process because your hands are much more likely to get into contact with the Armour Etch cream. Once the initial rinse is done, you can start to remove your painter's tape, and you can also remove your stencil. For those already familiar with Oracle's permanent vinyl, you know that it will stick very well. However, when it's run underwater this way and only applied for a short period of time, it's actually very easy to remove just with your hands. If you do have any difficulty with this, you can also do this removal with a weeding tool. And once it's done, you're just going to rinse off your surface one more time and dry it off. Initially, you may think that your design has just completely disappeared when it's been run under the water, but once it dries off, you'll really be able to see your etch very clearly. Just like this. So now that the wash process is complete, I am not going to be showing this again. You can always go back to this portion of the video if you have any questions. So this is a bit of a sneak preview, but the test runs 3 and 4 did not go very well in my opinion. The outcome was not as good looking as I was expecting it to be, so I decided to run those tests again. So this is now tests 5 and 6. It's the exact same processes as for 3 and 4, the only difference being the amount of Armour Etch that is being used. I consider this to be an even coat because the amount of Armour Etch that I'm applying is really sitting well into the stencil. So if you can imagine the amount of thickness associated with that stencil, the gaps that are created where you're placing your Armour Etch cream, those gaps are filled up so that way the top of the cream is basically in line with your stencil vinyl. So it's a much more even coat across the entire surface of the stencil. And this means that you can't really see the edges of the stencil quite as clearly as you probably did in my test runs 3 and 4, but it's also still somewhat visible, unlike what you saw in test 1 where it was a really heavy application. I'm going to mention here that I had opted to use gloves to start, and then over time found that the gloves actually got in the way. The gloves are really large on my hands and actually can make application less safe and made me more likely to drop my brush or just drop the glass. Making sure that your gloves fit is really important, and if you can't find gloves that fit properly, just take extra care when you're doing the application if you don't have them on, and again, make sure that you're washing your hands with soap and water after each of these runs. So now I'm going to show the results from my first 6 tests. You can see in this top one that there's actually a little bubble on the E. This is probably in part because I didn't move the Armour Etch at all. In test 2, the clarity of the etch is not quite as good as test 1, but still pretty good. And test 3 and 4, as I mentioned, are really just very patchy and uneven. So because of that result, of course, I ended up doing tests 5 and 6, and I'll show the results for that in just a moment. It's important to note too that the appearance of the etch, even though it looks a little bit uneven, it depends very much on the angle of your glass and the lighting and all the rest of these different variables. In most cases, your etches with these methods will actually look very good. I've really pushed the lighting to the limits to really show the patchiness that I'm trying to avoid, but it's really not obvious in day-to-day lighting. Based on these results, I am going to start working on my tests 7, 8, 9, and 10. The test method for these is based heavily on the success that I had with test run number 5, which was applying the Armour Etch cream and then moving the cream around at the 1.5 and 3.5 minute mark, so just 2 times during that interval. You can see that I'm planning on moving the cream around 2 times during the time interval for each of these 4 runs, but the overall time frame is changing. So 3 minutes total for test 7, 5 minutes for test 8, 10 minutes for test 9, and 15 minutes for test 10. And the point at which I'm moving the cream around is also changing based on the length of the duration. So I'm doing it roughly at every third of the time slot. I wanted to emphasize too that when you're applying Armour Etch, you'll come across these little crystals sometimes. I've seen in other videos that it is recommended to make sure that those are not on top of the area that you're hoping to see etched. So just push those off onto your painter's tape or onto the vinyl so that way they are not in contact with your glass surface. One thing to explain here is what I mean by swirling the etching cream or moving it on the surface. So if I applied the etching cream horizontally, let's say, and I let it sit for a period of time, when I go in and move it, I want to make sure I'm doing diagonal strokes or vertical strokes, something different than the horizontal that I had left sitting on the surface. And you also can move in more than one direction before you say, okay, I'm gonna let it sit now. But the idea is just to make sure that you're getting into those nooks and crannies. And here are the results from those 4 test runs. Like I had mentioned before, the lighting for all of these actually makes it look like they're all pretty good. All 4 test runs went pretty well. If anything, only test run 7 with a 3-minute interval had a little bit of unevenness that's obvious in the star. This is actually a good point to mention as well, that it's really the stars where you can see this unevenness. The word engrave itself looks very even in all of these test runs, and I believe that this is kind of a trick of the eyes. When you have a larger area that you're trying to etch, you're more likely to have some amount of unevenness, but when your design is narrow, it's not going to be nearly as obvious. So when possible, I would recommend doing a more narrow design, and you'll see more about what I mean by this at this point. So for my next project, I was planning to make some glass mugs with an etched design. As it turned out, the results from these were not very good, and so they ended up being built into my experiment set instead of into a project set. So for test 11, I'm using my favorite method from my prior test runs, which was the 5 minutes with movement at the 1.5 and 3.5 minute mark. I felt like that was a good level of effort for a pretty good outcome with the etching. However, I did not get the outcome that I wanted with this really large design. Again, it's a much bigger area, and so any inconsistencies in the etching became a lot more visible. So I did the same thing for test 12 as in test 11 because I figured, man, that method really should have worked. And so I just applied more Armour Etch, and this time using a popsicle stick for really heavy application, but turned out that wasn't great either, unfortunately. So for test 13, with my final glass mug, I decided to try again the method that seemed very popular in the YouTube community, which was applying your Armour Etch and moving it around non-stop for 3 minutes. And actually, this method I didn't think turned out very well either. So a couple takeaways from the mugs: be sure that you practice your application method before you start your first real project. And 2, as I mentioned earlier, when possible, make small and narrow designs for your etched areas. Now we can look at the results. So here is my test 11, which was the 5 minutes with 2 points of movement. In this result from test 12, even with the thick coat of Armour Etch, this is still a relatively uneven etching job. And for test 13 as well, with the favored method of constant movement, it's also very patchy. I mean, all 3 of these test runs were patchy in their own way and uneven in their own way, but overall just means back to the drawing board. So here I am preparing my glass with isopropyl alcohol using a larger test this time that is more representative of what went wrong in my mug experiments, and burnishing the vinyl onto the glass, peeling the transfer tape away, and then I'll just have to prep the glass with some painter's tape and start the experiments. Going a bit out of order, for test 15, I am going to be moving the Armour Etch around for 3 minutes straight using a narrow brush. The narrow brush is about half the width of the brush that I've been using for all my other test runs, so that's a 1/4 inch wide brush as opposed to the 1/2 inch brush. Test 14 is just 3 minutes of movement with the brush, so this is the exact same type of method as I used in mug test number 13. The reason that I'm replicating it here is because every piece of glass is a little different, and to really make sure that I have comparable results without changing too many variables, I need to have this as a constant for good comparison. For test 16, I'm doing 5 minutes of movement instead of the 3 minutes of movement that I've been doing previously. And for test 17, it's 5 minutes of movement and then allowing it all to sit in place for 5 minutes as well. And here are the results from those tests. You can see that test 14 turned out pretty well, and test 15, which was the exact same as 14 but with the narrow brush, went way worse. It's a lot more patchy. Test 16 with 5 minutes of movement and an even coat looked pretty okay, still a little bit of patchiness, and same goes for test 17 with 5 minutes of movement and 5 minutes of sitting. Before we go any further, I wanted to mention another important tip. Armour Etch actually will not lose its potency, so if you apply a thick enough coat of Armour Etch, you can try to scrape some of that back into your Armour Etch bottle. You can do that with a brush or a popsicle stick. When you do this though, you'll end up with some buildup around the rim of your bottle, so you want to make sure that you shake that properly right afterwards, so that way everything can redistribute, and you'll be ready to go for your next application. So coming back into these test runs, I'm going to be doing my next 4, which will be 10 minutes of sitting with an even coat, 10 minutes of sitting with a thick coat, which I am applying with the paintbrush, but it is definitely a thicker coat than test 18. Test 20, which is 5 minutes of movement repeated twice, and test 21, which is 3 minutes of movement repeated twice. So what I mean by repeating this is that I am going to be applying the Armour Etch, allowing it to do its thing for the 5 minutes where I'm constantly moving it around, bring it over to the sink and properly rinse off the Armour Etch using the brush to really get into those corners, but not taking any of the tape or the stencil vinyl off. I'm going to actually be bringing it back to the table after that first round and repeating the entire process. Here you can see the difference between test 18 and 19 as far as how much Armour Etch is applied. You can really barely make out the lettering on test 19. So here's the results from the first wash on tests 20 and 21. And you can see that I'm starting to go right back over those just like I did the first time, even though we already have a bit of that frosted glass appearance. The hope here is that by applying it a second time around, we can even out any of that patchiness that may have occurred in the first. Here are the results. You can see that tests 18 and 19 both turned out pretty well, but there's definitely still some patchiness. You can really see it dependent again on the angle and the lighting. You can see here that test 20 turned out really well. You can barely see any brush strokes in the etch. It looks very even. You can also see that in test 21, which is very similar to test 20, there is definitely some more patchiness. Because the test where I had 2 runs of 5 minutes with constant movement turned out so well, I'm doing a test where I'm moving the Armour Etch around for 10 minutes straight, which is the equivalent of the 2 rounds of 5 minutes, just to see if the outcome is any better and we can save the step of that rinse in the middle. Test number 23 is 5 minutes of movement done twice, just like in test 20. However, this is going to be done with very long strokes, so that way I'm covering the entire width of my design instead of doing it in short strokes that I would sort of need to pick up and continue. For test 24, I'm just applying the Armour Etch as evenly as possible and then going to let that sit for 20 minutes straight. When I talk about applying it this way, I'm going to be applying in more than just one direction, again to try to make sure that I'm getting good even coverage before just letting it sit to do its thing. And you can see the result of my first wash from test 23 right here. The frost already looks very good, and I'll be ready to start my second round. And finally, for test number 25, I'm returning back to that old method that I thought would actually be my favorite, which was applying the Armour Etch for an extended period with movement of the cream at 2 time intervals. For this, I'm doing a 15-minute application with movement at the 5-minute and 10-minute mark, which I have not done in several test runs now. One thing I want to highlight is that in test 22, where I'm trying to move the Armour Etch for 10 minutes straight, you can see that it's becoming more like a paste and very difficult to work with and move around. I actually needed to continue to add a little bit more Armour Etch onto the glass to just get a bit more workability. And this was a very difficult process. Once it's done, you can see that I'm starting to remove some of the Armour Etch, just like I showed you in the method earlier for saving more of your materials. So here are the test results. You can see that 10 minutes of moving didn't turn out very well. However, doing the 2 runs of 5 minutes with long strokes is nearly flawless. My final 2 runs, number 24 and 25, did not turn out very well. Lots of patchiness, kind of not the way that you would want to see. So really that 5 minutes of movement method done twice is the winner. One reason why I think that this is so much better than doing 10 minutes of straight movement is because of the fact that the Armour Etch becomes more like a paste. I think that it doesn't make as good contact with the glass, makes it less even, and when you only have it sitting out and being worked for 5 minutes, that seems to allow for a much better result. Here is a summary of all of my test runs for your reference. I will also place these in the description box below. And I'll wrap up with some final tips. First, be sure that you move any glass crystals off of your etched area if you do see them. Second, make sure that you're using a brush with a width that is suitable for the design size that you're working with, so nothing that's too narrow. 3, when possible, use a narrow, intricate design. This allows for other application options that will look just as good to be used, that will probably take less time and effort than my recommendation in tip 4, which is to use 2 applications of 5 minutes with constant movement for any areas that are larger than about 1 inch by 1 inch. Doing this 2 times is really important to making sure that you get a nice, even looking etch. And tip 5, practice your application method before you start your projects that you're planning to gift or sell. Really important that you feel comfortable with the method that you're using and know how much Armour Etch you should actually be using on your glass. I personally found that it did make a really big difference. And that's it. I'll wrap up here with my 4 test glasses. You can see that across the board, all of these etches actually don't look that bad. They all look pretty good. But when you do really zoom in, get the lighting at just the right angle, you can start to see that unevenness. Really hope that you find these tips helpful. And if you do use your own Armour Etch application method that you like better than any of the ones that I tested, please leave a comment so I can give that a try as well, and maybe I'll make a follow-up to this video in the future. Thanks so much for watching.